This video covers Chapter 4, Section 2, which is an introduction to congruent figures. So we've already talked this year about what it means for segments to be congruent and also what it means for angles to be congruent. But here we're going to talk about what it means for a figure or a shape to be congruent to another figure. So here we actually have an example of two triangles that are congruent. And you'll notice these two triangles are identical in every way. Each angle and side of this triangle has an angle or side of this triangle that it is congruent to. So congruent figures are just figures that have the exact same shape and size as one another. And if two figures are congruent, then their corresponding sides are congruent and their corresponding angles are congruent. So for example, in this triangle, we have three angles that are congruent to the three angles over here. Angle B is congruent to angle E. And same thing for each side. If we pick any side on this triangle, for example, side CD, it is congruent to side FG over here on this triangle. These triangles are the exact shape and size. So when we have congruent figures, we can write a congruency statement. A congruency statement is a statement that states that the two figures are congruent, and it tells you which parts are congruent to one another. So for example, our congruency statement here would be triangle BCD is congruent to triangle EFG. Now here, the order that we write the letters of the triangle matters. And let me explain what I mean by that. So in our previous part, we talked about how the corresponding sides are congruent and the corresponding angles are congruent. Those congruent parts are going to match up in our congruency statement. For example, B comes first in triangle BCD, and we see that B has three arcs. If we write out BCD is congruent to EFG, that means angle B and angle E will be congruent. And you can see that they are both marked with three arcs. So when we have a congruency statement, we can use that to write out a bunch of other congruency statements about segments and angles. So for example, BC is congruent to EF. BC are the first two letters in our first triangle. EF is our first two letters in our second triangle. And we can see that EF, which has two tick marks, is congruent to BC. Similarly, we have CD is congruent to FG. 2 and 3, they're congruent. And then BD, the first letter and the last letter, is congruent to EG, the first letter and the last letter there. Additionally, corresponding angles. We have that B is congruent to E, C is congruent to F, and D is congruent to G. Again, B is congruent to E because they both come first in the congruency statement. C is congruent to F because they both come second. D is congruent to G because they both come third, and we can see those marked in this diagram as well. All right, so here we don't have a diagram, but we can still say what things must be congruent. So what I want you to do right now is pause the video, write this down, and try to fill in your answers. And then when you're ready, resume the video, and you will see the answers explained to you. So our first answer should be that RS is congruent to XY. We had RS here. We just are looking for what the first two letters are of this one right here. So RS must be congruent to XY. Next, we had XZ, and XZ must be congruent to RT. X and Z, X is the first letter, Z is the last letter. Over here, R is the first letter, and T is the last letter. Our next one, T is congruent to Z. Both of those letters come last. Y is congruent to S. Both are in the middle. And then lastly, we have some congruency statements. If we look at TSR, these would go T, then S, then R. We would need to follow the same pattern for this triangle. So Z, then Y, then X. And lastly, here we have YZX. That goes second letter, third letter, first letter. So to complete our congruency statement, we need to go second letter, third letter, first letter. All right, last thing we are going to do. If These are quadrilaterals now, not triangles. Quadrilateral, CDEF, a four-sided shape, is congruent to LMNO, a four-sided shape. Let's write out the congruent pairs of sides at angles. So here, since there's four letters, we're going to have four pairs of sides and four pairs of angles. So our first one, we're going to write it down. It would be CD is congruent to LM. Next segment would be DE is congruent to MN. Then we'd have EF is congruent to NO. And then our last one would be CF is congruent to LO. When we're thinking about angles, we're going to have four angles here: angle C, angle D, angle E, and angle F. And those will be congruent to L, M, N, and O respectively.